America has the most powerful conventional bomb on Earth. 30,000 pounds of steel and explosive, built to punch through 90 meters of solid rock and keep going. Nothing buried underground has ever truly been safe from it. 7 stealth bombers proved that on a single night last year, flying halfway around the planet, past every radar Iran owned, to hit the most protected nuclear sites on the face of the Earth. And they hit them. 2 kilometers from where that bomb already did its job. There's a mountain it has never touched. Not once. Not during that first war. Not during 11 straight nights of strikes this year when American air power hit nearly everything Iran had left standing. This one it left alone. On purpose. Because inside it, according to Israeli intelligence now sitting on the president's desk, are thousands of Iranian centrifuges, moved there in secret, buried under solid granite, waiting to restart the one program America already spent a year trying to bury for good. They call it Pickaxe Mountain. And it might be the last place on Earth America hasn't decided whether it can beat. This week, the president looked straight at reporters and said the words out loud. We'll be hitting that area pretty soon and very heavily. Not a threat buried in diplomatic language. A promise from the one country that has already proven it can reach anywhere on the planet it chooses to. Then, almost in the same breath, he said something far more dangerous than the threat itself. We see no activity there. The most powerful military on Earth, the same one that just flew a stealth bomber payload straight through Iran's air defenses and hit exactly what it aimed at, is now staring at a mountain, unsure if its next target is even worth the strike. That's not weakness. That's a superpower deciding whether to use its biggest weapon on an enemy that's finally learned to hide from it. Let's rebuild the timeline, because this story didn't start this week. It started in June 2025, what the mission history books will likely remember as Operation Midnight Hammer. On the night of June 21st into June 22nd, 2025, 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers lifted off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and flew an 18-hour, 3 refueling round trip halfway around the planet. Their cargo, 14 GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs, each one designed to punch through more than 60 meters of reinforced rock before detonating. 12 of those bombs went into the Fortifying facility near Qom. 2 went into Natanz, a U.S. submarine, added more than 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles against the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center for good measure. It was, by any operational standard, one of the most complex precision strikes American air power has ever executed. A mission so sensitive that even the pilots' own families weren't told what was happening until the strikes were already public knowledge. The immediate assessments were, predictably, all over the map, depending on who you asked. U.S. officials called the damage to all 3 sites extremely severe. A leaked Defense Intelligence Agency report suggested the setback might only be a matter of months, not years, and that the sites were damaged but not destroyed. Israeli intelligence landed somewhere in between. Iran's own initial public statements downplayed the damage as quite superficial, before later acknowledging significant and serious damages. The International Atomic Energy Agency, for its part, said simply that the sites had suffered enormous damage. Nobody, notably, ever claimed Iran's nuclear ambitions had been erased entirely. They claimed it had been set back. Set back to what, though, turned out to be the real question, and the answer, we now know, was set back long enough for Iran to start digging somewhere else. That's where Pickaxe Mountain enters the picture. The facility isn't new. Iran actually began construction back in 2020, describing it publicly at the time as a replacement centrifuge assembly plant for a site at Natanz that had already been sabotaged years earlier. Iran even told the International Atomic Energy Agency back in 2021 that it intended to run nuclear activity there eventually. But for years, Pickaxe Mountain sat in the background of the Iran nuclear story. A known construction project, monitored from orbit, but not treated as urgent. Satellite imagery through late 2025 showed continuing tunnel work and a growing pile of excavated rock and soil at the site, but nothing that screamed imminent threat. Then came the Wall Street Journal report that changed the entire conversation. Citing both American and Israeli officials, the journal reported that Israeli intelligence assessed Iran had moved thousands of uranium-enrichment centrifuges into the underground halls at Pickaxe Mountain, and that the transfer happened last fall in the months immediately following the June 2025 strikes. In other words, while the world was still debating how much damage Midnight Hammer had actually done to Fordo and Natanz, Iran was reportedly already relocating its most sensitive enrichment hardware to a site that had never been touched and was now buried deeper and more heavily fortified than anything American bunker busters had previously been tested against. The math on that fortification is what makes military planners nervous. Fordo, widely considered Iran's toughest target before all this, sits under roughly 80 to 90 meters of rock. Pickaxe Mountain's peak rises to around 1,600 meters above sea level, and the tunnel complex is dug in near its base. Analysts and former IAEA officials who've studied the available imagery describe the overburden as potentially deeper than anything the GBU-57 was originally engineered against. On top of that, Institute for Science and international security researchers examining recent satellite photos have documented Iran actively reinforcing the site's defenses in real time. Rock and soil pushed back and leveled over one of the eastern tunnel portals, and a newly built concrete reinforced headwork structure at the tunnel entrance, specifically designed, the Institute's analysts note, to allow Iran to keep piling on additional overburden of rock, soil, or concrete as a shield against exactly the kind of strike Washington keeps threatening. Iran, notably, has never allowed IAEA inspectors anywhere near Pickaxe Mountain and has given no public details about what precisely happens inside it. That total opacity, a fortified off-limits mountain facility next door to a site the U.S. has already bombed twice, is precisely the kind of vacuum that gets filled with worst-case assumptions on one side and defiant threats on the other. And it's precisely why, whatever happens next with bombs, the real front line of this story right now runs through orbiting satellites, quiet reconnaissance flights, and a small fleet of stealth bombers parked at forward bases, waiting for someone to decide the picture has changed enough to act. Here's the thing. Most casual observers get wrong about this story. They think of the Iran War as a single 12-day event that ended in June 2025. It didn't end. It paused, then reignited. And by the numbers, the second phase has actually been longer and in some ways more relentless than the first. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a new, more intensive air campaign against Iran, this time explicitly framed according to reporting on the operation as an effort to destabilize the regime in Tehran itself, not merely degrade its nuclear infrastructure. This wasn't a repeat of Midnight Hammer's single dramatic night. This was sustained. U.S. Central Command has kept up strikes on Iranian targets for stretches running 11 straight nights at a time, hitting military operations centers, drone storage facilities, and logistics infrastructure. Tehran depends on to project power and to threaten commercial shipping through the Gulf. The strike list from the second phase reads differently than the first. Where Midnight Hammer focused almost entirely on the 3 declared nuclear enrichment sites, this campaign has ranged much wider. American B-2 bombers reportedly struck an underground IRGC command bunker near Tehran using the same 30,000-pound GBU-57 bombs. This time, aimed not at centrifuges, but at a concentration of senior Iranian military leadership identified through what officials described as time-sensitive intelligence. That strike matters strategically because it signals something new. The bunker buster, once reserved almost exclusively for nuclear infrastructure, is now being used against leadership and command targets too, meaning Iran's decades-old assumption that depth and fortification would protect its senior decision-makers no longer holds the way it once did. Other operations during this window carried their own names and their own targets. Operation Epic Fury saw B-2 Spirit bombers drop dozens of smaller 2,000-pound penetrator bombs, a mix of BLU-109 warheads and Mk-84 bomb bodies fitted with GPS guidance kits, against deeply buried Iranian ballistic missile launch. Infrastructure, aiming to degrade Tehran's long-range strike capability at its source, rather than intercepting missiles after launch. Around the same period, B-1B Lancers were spotted at RAF Fairford in the UK, having their standard weapons swapped out for JDAM bomb loadouts, conducted in broad daylight in full view of open-source observers tracking the base, a move analysts read as a deliberate signal to Tehran that the campaign against its nuclear-linked sites wasn't winding down, it was widening. Iran, for its part, hasn't simply absorbed all of this passively. On March 20th, 2026, Iran launched at least 2 Khorramshahr-4 intercontinental ballistic missiles toward Diego Garcia, the U.S.-British base in the Indian Ocean that has repeatedly served as a staging ground for American bomber deployments during this whole saga. Neither missile hit its target. One failed in flight, and the other was intercepted by an SM-3 missile fired from a U.S. warship. Iran denied responsibility entirely, calling the whole episode a false flag operation, but the United Kingdom's own government treated it as real enough to respond. London's Foreign Secretary condemned the strike and expanded the permissions granted to the United States to launch operations from British-controlled bases in response. That Diego Garcia episode is worth sitting with for a second because it explains a pattern that's been repeating since early 2025. The movement of B-2 bombers has itself become a running storyline, almost a barometer of tension, independent of whether or when bombs actually drop. Go back to March and April of 2025, before any of the strikes on Iran's nuclear sites had even happened, and you'll find repeated waves of B-2 deployments to Guam and Diego Garcia, each one triggering fresh speculation about an imminent strike on Fordo. At one point, satellite imagery analyzed by outside observers showed at least 6 B-2s, representing roughly a third of the Air Force's entire operational stealth bomber fleet, parked on the runway at Naval Support Facility Diego Garcia at once, accompanied by a fleet of KC-135 refueling tankers. Analysts at the time called it exactly what it looked like, a message. Not necessarily a plan to strike immediately, but a deliberate, visible demonstration of capability and reach, positioned close enough to Iran to act on short notice if Washington gave the order. That pattern has repeated with almost rhythmic regularity ever since. Bombers forward deployed during periods of peak tension, then quietly swapped out for B-52s, considered a lower signal aircraft. Once tensions cool, it happened after the initial Yemen bombing campaign against the Houthis wound down in mid-2025. It's almost certainly happening again right now, given the current threats swirling around Pickaxe Mountain. Which brings us to the strange, almost paradoxical moment the world is sitting in this week. On July 13th, in an interview on the Hugh Hewitt Show, President Trump said plainly, "We're going to take out Pickaxe Mountain. Tell the Iranians," even though he didn't name it explicitly at the time. And yet, in the very same breath as his most recent threat, the president undercut the urgency of his own rhetoric. "We see no activity there," he said. "They're not doing well with their nuclear situation. Every time we hear about it, we blow it up. So they don't like talking about it." That's the tension driving this entire story right now. A president publicly promising to destroy a mountain while simultaneously admitting his own surveillance shows nothing actively happening inside it at this exact moment. Multiple defense sources briefed on the matter, speaking to reporters on condition of anonymity, have said something similar in more measured language. There is no current operational threat emanating from Pickaxe Mountain, and the best rationale for striking it right now would be preventive, eliminating a future capability before it becomes an active one, not neutralizing an ongoing weapons program today. That distinction, preventive versus reactive, is precisely the kind of decision that doesn't get made on gut instinct. It gets made on imagery, on signals intelligence, and on the accumulated judgment of analysts staring at satellite photographs of a tunnel entrance for months on end, looking for the one detail that changes the calculus, which is exactly the job being done right now by everyone watching Pickaxe Mountain from above. If you strip away the political theater, the presidential threats, the Iranian counter-threats, the cable news chyrons, what's actually happening around Pickaxe Mountain right now is a textbook intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operation. And understanding how that machinery works tells you far more about what happens next than any single quote from a press conference. Start with the satellites. Commercial satellite imagery providers, companies, like Vantor, whose photos have been cited repeatedly by outlets from the Wall Street Journal to the Jerusalem Post, have been capturing regular passes over Pickaxe Mountain for well over a year now. These aren't grainy Cold War-era spy photos. They're high-resolution commercial imagery, good enough to distinguish. Individual vehicles at tunnel entrances, count construction equipment, and track exactly how much excavated material has been piled at each portal from one month to the next. Analysts at the Institute for Science and International Security have been publishing detailed monthly breakdowns of exactly this kind of imagery, noting, for instance, that at one of the eastern tunnel entrances, rock and soil have visibly been pushed back and leveled directly on top of the portal, and that a concrete reinforced headwork structure was added to the tunnel entrance extension within just the last month, specifically engineered to allow additional overburden, more rock, more soil, more concrete, to be piled on as protection against exactly the kind of penetrating strike Washington keeps threatening. That's the unclassified picture, the version available to any journalist or analyst with a subscription to commercial satellite data. Above and beyond that sits the classified layer, signals intelligence, human intelligence networks, and reportedly direct intelligence sharing from Israel, whose assessment about the centrifuge transfer to Pickaxe Mountain is what apparently triggered this entire round of American threats in the first place. According to the Wall Street Journal's sourcing, Israeli officials told their American counterparts that intelligence shows Iran moved the centrifuges into the mountain last fall, information serious enough that U.S. officials are now treating it as the basis for renewed strike planning, even without independent visual confirmation of ongoing enrichment activity inside. Then there's the physical, forward-deployed layer of this surveillance and deterrence apparatus, the aircraft themselves. This is where the B-2 fleet's role gets more interesting than simply waiting to drop bombs. Stealth bombers forward, based at Diego Garcia or rotated through Guam, aren't just static deterrents sitting on a runway. Their presence in theater, combined with supporting reconnaissance aircraft and tanker support, gives American commanders the ability to conduct short-notice overflight and strike package rehearsal missions far closer to Iranian airspace than anything launched from the continental United States could manage without enormous lead time. Every time a B-2 wing rotates, Into Diego Garcia, it's simultaneously a signal to Tehran and a genuine operational repositioning, shortening the decision to impact timeline from many hours down to a fraction of that, in case Washington decides the intelligence picture has crossed a threshold that demands immediate action rather than a scheduled telegraphed strike. This is also, worth noting, a two-way intelligence contest. Iran isn't simply sitting still while satellites photograph its mountain. The construction activity analysts have documented, the backfilled tunnel portals, the reinforced concrete headworks, the piles of additional overburdened material staged near entrances, is itself a response to the surveillance. Iran knows it's being watched continuously, and its engineers are visibly adapting the site's defenses in real time specifically to defeat the kind of penetrating munitions American bombers have already used against Fordo and Natanz. It's an arms race being fought not with new weapons, but with rock, soil, and concrete versus penetrator physics, a contest over how many meters of overburden it takes to stop a bomb, playing out in slow motion, one satellite pass at a time. Iran's public posture, meanwhile, has stayed defiant even as the physical fortification work continues quietly underground. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya Military Command, the umbrella organization overseeing much of the country's conventional and strategic military coordination, responded to Trump's Pickaxe Mountain threat by warning that any such strike would represent, in their words, an explosion of war in the region, and vowed retaliation against all the interests of America, the allies and supporters, if it happens. That's not a subtle statement. It's a direct warning that a strike on Pickaxe Mountain wouldn't be treated as another incremental escalation in an already running conflict. It would be treated by Tehran as a fundamentally different threshold, potentially triggering a much broader regional response than anything seen in either the June 2025 or February 2026 rounds of fighting. And this is where the IAEA's own limitations become impossible to ignore. Director General Rafael Grossi's agency has repeatedly acknowledged it simply doesn't have the access needed to independently verify what's actually happening inside Iran's most sensitive sites right now. IAEA reports on Iran's nuclear program in recent months have been criticized by outside non-proliferation analysts for providing far less detail than what Grossi himself has described in media interviews, offering no real information, for instance, on where Iran's stockpiles of highly enriched uranium currently sit, and no acknowledgement at all of the weapons-relevant sites struck during the 2025 and 2026 conflicts, despite substantial open-source evidence about their nuclear significance. In practical terms, that means the outside world's most authoritative nuclear watchdog is currently working with a picture that's less complete than what journalists are piecing together from commercial satellite photos and leaked intelligence assessments. That's an unusual, uncomfortable position for the IAEA to be in, and it's part of why so much of the actual analytical weight in this story is being carried by open-source researchers and defense reporters rather than by the institution technically mandated to monitor exactly this kind of activity. So when people ask, are the B-2s about to hit Pickaxe Mountain? The honest answer is, nobody outside a very small circle knows for certain. And even inside that circle, the debate hinges on an unresolved question, whether the site currently represents an active, ongoing threat or a future capability worth eliminating preventively before it becomes one. Everything happening in the skies and in orbit above Iran right now is aimed at trying to answer exactly that question before anyone commits to another mission like Midnight Hammer. So let's talk about where this actually goes from here. Because regardless of whether Washington ultimately decides to strike Pickaxe Mountain, the strategic picture that's emerged over the past year points to some fairly clear conclusions about what comes next. First, the technical challenge of Pickaxe. Mountain itself is not a solved problem, even with the weapons America already has. The GBU-57 was purpose-built over roughly 2 decades of development, specifically to answer the threat posed by Fordo, a facility buried 80 to 90 meters under rock. Pickaxe Mountain's geometry sitting under a peak that rises some 1,600 meters above sea level, and reinforced with actively engineered overburden specifically designed to defeat penetrating munitions, may represent a target that exceeds what even America's heaviest conventional bunker buster was designed against. That doesn't mean a strike couldn't damage or delay the site. American officials have shown a consistent willingness to hit targets even without full confidence in total destruction, as the ambiguous outcomes at Fordo and Natanz in 2025 demonstrated. But it does mean that any strike on Pickaxe Mountain would likely be, at best, another setback, not a final solution. Precisely the same outcome that led Iran to start digging into this mountain in the first place after the last round of strikes. Second, watch the centrifuge question closely, because it's the detail that actually matters most for non-proliferation purposes, more than any single explosion. If Israeli intelligence is correct that thousands of centrifuges have already been moved into Pickaxe Mountain, then the strategic value of hitting the site isn't really about stopping an active enrichment program. by the administration's own admission, there's no current activity to stop. It's about destroying stored equipment and denying Iran the ability to restart enrichment quickly at a moment of its choosing, once international attention drifts elsewhere. That's a fundamentally different kind of target than an operating enrichment hall, and it changes the calculus around timing. There's no ticking clock forcing an immediate strike the way there would be if centrifuges were actively spinning right now, which is presumably part of why, despite months of threats, no strike order has actually been given. Third, the regional escalation risk that Iran's own military command has explicitly flagged shouldn't be dismissed as rhetoric. Iran has already demonstrated with the March 2026 Khorramshahr-4 launches toward Diego Garcia a willingness to strike at forward American basing infrastructure directly, even if those particular missiles failed to connect. A strike specifically targeting Pickaxe Mountain, a site Tehran has spent years and enormous resources fortifying, and which it has explicitly framed as crossing a different threshold than previous strikes, carries a real risk of triggering a more determined Iranian retaliatory response than anything seen so far in this multi-year conflict. British officials clearly took the Diego Garcia missile launch seriously enough to expand American basing permissions in response, which tells you something about how seriously allied governments are treating the escalation risk baked into any future strike against Iran's most protected remaining site. Fourth, and maybe most importantly for understanding the coming weeks, watch the B-2 and B-52 rotation patterns at Diego Garcia and Guam, because that's historically been the most reliable early signal of where this is actually heading. More reliable than any single presidential statement. The pattern established over the past year and a half has been consistent. B-2s forward deployed during periods of genuine operational planning, then quietly swapped for the lower signature B-52s once tensions ease and no strike is imminent. If satellite trackers and open source aviation analysts start documenting another significant B-2 buildup at either base in the coming days, accompanied by a corresponding surge in KC-135 or KC-46 tanker support, that combination has historically preceded actual strikes by a matter of weeks, not months. Absent that kind of buildup, the far more likely read is that this remains what it's been for months now, a deterrence posture, and an intelligence gathering operation, not an imminent operation. Fifth, there's the diplomatic angle worth watching too. Every previous point of maximum tension in this saga, the initial 2025 buildup, the Yemen campaign, the February 2026 escalation, has eventually been followed by some kind of cooling period, even if brief, often coinciding with quiet diplomatic contacts or shifts in international attention elsewhere. Whether that pattern holds this time depends heavily on factors well outside Iran's nuclear program specifically. The broader state of U.S.-Iran back-channel communications, Israel's own independent calculus about acceptable risk, and how much domestic and international pressure builds around the idea of opening yet another active front in a conflict that, by any honest accounting, has already run far longer and involved far more strikes than most observers expected when Operation Midnight. Hammer first made headlines back in June 2025. What's clear, regardless of how the Pickaxe Mountain question resolves, is that Iran's underground strategy, burying critical nuclear infrastructure deeper, reinforcing tunnel entrances against penetrating munitions, and dispersing capability across multiple, hardened sites rather than concentrating it in a few well-known facilities, is a direct, engineered response to exactly the kind of overwhelming air power the United States demonstrated in June 2025. It's an arms race playing out underground, largely invisible to the public, tracked mostly through satellite. Photographs of tunnel entrances and leaked intelligence assessments rather than through any dramatic single moment. And above it all, quietly, patiently, the B-2s keep watching, rotating through island bases thousands of miles from Tehran, ready to fly the same 18-hour round trip that made history in June 2025, waiting for someone in Washington to decide that watching isn't enough anymore.